Hey everyone, my name is Dr. John Keyes. I'm an assistant professor of history at the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, Ontario. And this is just a public-facing video looking at a burning question. It's a burning question I get in classes, and it's a burning question I get when I talk with friends, acquaintances, family, the general public. Whenever anyone seems to have a question about naval stuff, one of the things that comes up is that, what on earth is a Corvette? We're buying new frigates. What does that mean? There's a new plan to build a new class of battleship in the United States. What is a battleship? How is that different than, say, a destroyer or a cruiser or a frigate? And so I decided to make a brief video that should be useful to pretty much anyone interested in these questions. Looking at basically different ship classes, basically we'll say from the turn of the 20th century onward. Now, first, a few caveats here. This video, it's very bare bones. I'm just looking at the relative roles and sizes of different classes of ship in general terms throughout a fairly long period. Okay, so this means that I won't be going into, for example, the exact complement, so that's the size of the crew, or the exact tonnage, how big and heavy certain ships were. Because it's if this video is for people who would find that level of detail confusing, frankly, as I often do. And it is confusing because as the roles of ships change, as we get new systems, we get, for example, a modern-day frigate, which has almost the same tonnage as a Second World War cruiser, which is technically two classes up, right? Different. We'll see. I'm going to use an example at the end of this, talking about the new Canadian destroyers, which are based off a British frigate. To say, not all ship class. These are rough boundaries, right? In terms of how ships are classified, there's no hard and fast rule. What is interesting, though, about understanding different ship classes is even if different countries define them differently, different nations define these ship classes differently, that actually tells you a lot about how they want to use them, okay? So it's going to be very general, right? The other thing I'll note here is I'm not going to go into a lot of operational history, pretty much almost none on these ships. There will be some famous ships I mention. If you're outraged that I'm not getting through, I'm not talking, for example, about the specific exploits of the German pocket battleship Graf Spee, congratulations. That means that this video is actually, you've grown beyond this video. You're like a hermit crab that's grown out of its shell, and you have to find something else to climb into, which would probably be a book on naval history, right? So if I'm not mentioning the specific operational history of a ship, and it's something you care deeply about, you can get angry in the comments, but I'm not going to reply to them because this just isn't for you, right? And the last caveat here is that there's some. I'm not going to be going into a lot of detail, pretty much any detail on carriers. I'm going to mention them. They're kind of their own thing. They deserve their own video. Just at some point it gets confusing, and I won't be talking a lot about post 1945 submarines. Okay, so we're talking, for example, SSNs. So that's basically nuclear powered attack submarines, and SSBNs, or nuclear powered missile submarines. They're very important, but as I did up the script for this video, did up the notes for this video, boy, they were a bridge too far. Again, something else that kind of deserves their own video, right? So with all of that said, let's get right into it. So, right, what on earth is a Corvette? Well, we'll get there in a minute. But before we start talking about Corvettes, right, I have to just frame this for you, right? This is a big, scary diagram. There's a lot going on. Trust me, we're going to build to this, right? But roughly speaking, when we're talking about different classes of ship, we're talking about, I mapped these different kind of naval vessels out on two axes, okay? If you look at the x-axis, right, we have ships that either target naval vessels, right? So those are ships designed to sink other naval ships, okay? Ships in gray, sinking other ships in gray. On the right side of that x-axis, we've got targeting merchant ships. So those are ships designed to sink ships that are carrying food supplies, typically have, by definition, have civilian crews. Okay, so if you're looking, for example, merchant shipping was the central focus of the German U-boat campaign in the Second World War. That kind of stuff. And then if you look on the y-axis, you've got on the top, offensive. What I mean by offensive is these are ships whose primary job is to sink other ships, be they merchant ships or naval ships. Okay, they've got the big guns and they're designed to transform ships into artificial reefs. On the bottom, you've got defensive and support tasks, right? So these are ships, for example, designed to protect other ships from submarines, designed to provide a screen. So when I say a screen, that's basically, if you could imagine, just kind of an early warning system, right? A bunch of ships out in front of other ships designed not so much to sink other ships, but to warn the big ships that other big ships are coming. In more modern applications, right? Some of these screening ships will provide air defense, right? They provide little bubbles of air defense against enemy missiles and enemy aircraft, that sort of thing. Okay, so as we go down the y-axis, you get ships that are more for protecting either other naval ships or protecting convoys. Again, if you find this a little confusing, please don't be intimidated. We'll build to it. If you find it offensively simple, again, congratulations, you're a hermit crab. You're a hermit crab. You found a bigger shell. I can't help you. You have to find that shell on your own. Okay, right. Also, again, this is a more digestible diagram here. But, excuse me, this is a more digestible diagram, but again, believe me, we'll build to it, okay? Just some really rough terminology for you. At the top, we've got capital ships. Okay, so these are ships that are at the center of a fleet, right? These have a lot of offensive firepower. They're not super flexible. They're designed primarily to sink other ships. They need other ships to help them out, for example, to do that screening thing, right? Find other ships, provide maybe air defense, maybe defense against submarines, right? They're typically few in number, right? There's a bit of economics going on. So they can't be everywhere at once. And so, anyway, these are kind of the big ships, the centerpiece of a group. I've put fleet carriers there. When I say fleet carriers, I just mean big heckin' aircraft carriers, right? Today, that, for example, a fleet carrier might be, the French Charles de Gaulle, or, for example, an American nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. That's roughly where they fit. We're not going to be talking really much about aircraft carriers today. Below that, we have cruisers, right? Cruisers, when you think about it, cruisers are ships that can do basically two things, right? One, they can act as screening ships or support ships for capital ships, right? They can protect them. They can, if you can imagine a screen of cruisers out in front of various weights. But some cruisers, again, depending on who you talk to, can also do things like hunt enemy merchant ships, right? So they're a bit faster, they're a bit smaller, they can kind of act on their own against merchant ships, can't really act on their own against enemy capital ships. This is a lot. Trust me, we'll get to it. You'll be fine. All right, and then at the bottom, sloops. Now, sloops is it's a weird term. It's been repurposed. If you're tuning in from the United States, for example, the Americans don't use this term sloop, and you might find it offensive. I don't really mean offensive, but you might find it professionally offensive. What is this term? That's not a sloop. It's something else. It's a convenient term, all right? So whether you like it or not, well, if you don't like it, I guess you're free to make your own video using American terminology, and perhaps, whatever your national tradition, there might even be, I'm sure there's a German compound word for this that's far more accurate. I don't speak German, so feel free to let me know. Anyway, when we're talking about sloops, really we're talking about specialized vessels that do typically specialized defensive tasks. It's changed a bit, and I'll get into that a bit later in the video, but for example, a minesweeper, right? It sweeps mines. Corvettes kind of start off as minesweepers. They end up doing they're meant for coastal escort. They end up doing something more, and so on. So we'll get into those. I'll also note briefly there are some different colors I've used here. So blue refers to ships designed for a blue water navy. Talking about blue water navy, that means like big. These are ships designed to be on the ocean, open ocean, right? Designed for, or at least capable of big kind of fleet battles. You can say in the middle of the Atlantic or whatever. Green, a green water navy. It's designed more for kind of coastal, like stuff around coasts. It's a really crude distinction. Okay, so for example, we'll get into Corvettes. They were initially designed for kind of green water tasks, and they end up being pressed into doing blue water tasks. Then we get something called a frigate, which is sort of like a super Corvette. I don't want to again. There's no need to get too intimidated by the distinction. I just want to actually reassure you that the hard line between green and blue, it's not really there. It's a bit fuzzy, and so if it seems fuzzy to you, it should be fuzzy. So don't worry, you're doing fine. Okay, and lastly, I group torpedo boats and submarines in their own little group because they are in their own little group. We'll get into that. Okay, so righto. So let's just start. When I start talking about the terminology for all these ships, I should note that I'm really talking about really the last decades of the 19th century, so the 1800s, going into the 20th century. Because, for example, the term, a lot of these naval terms existed in the age of sail. For example, frigate, but a frigate in the age of sail and a frigate in modern usage, very different roles, very different ships. Same cruiser, kind of similar. The names don't carry over very well. They often do distinct things. So I'm going to start really as that ship, as we go from the age of sail. I'm not really going to talk about what ships were called in the age of sail. I'll just talk about what ships are being called at the end of the age of sail, when we start getting the age of steam. So long story short, right? Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution really starts about 1750, but it takes a while to map that Industrial Revolution onto naval building. And the easy answer to say, and I've seen written in a couple of places, is that essentially admiralties and ship designers were just conservative by nature. I don't think that's particularly fair. It's not fair for a couple of reasons. Namely, one, even if you get steam engines going, developing an effective source of propulsion, very, very difficult. So, for example, as early as the 1820s, you start getting paddle boats, steam-powered paddle boats, the paddle boats with the wheels on the side. Those are great for doing things like going up and down the Mississippi, famously in with Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. But those don't really work well on the open ocean or really even along the coast. And then also when you think about naval construction, if you can get it makes sense. You can suddenly have lots of iron. You can make iron much more cheaply. Great, but can you make that iron not corrode pretty much instantly when it hits salt water, right? You need to learn a lot about metallurgy. Also, you need to really work on the reliability of steam engines, especially if you're going any kind of great distance. And then also, just in terms of ship design, it's great if you have big, heavier rifled cannons, right? So modern cannons at the time, for example, like the Armstrong gun from the 1860s. These are as opposed to the cannons you might have seen, for example, in Master and Commander, the film, right? When the cannons are going and they're on the lower deck and they're reloading them in a single piece of metal. Armstrong guns were breech loaders, so they actually had a screw that came off the back, and you put the charge in the back, and that meant you could rifle the barrel, so you could put twists in the barrel, essentially, and then fire shells more accurately and further. That's all great, but European shipbuilders have gotten really good at designing ships with those old style cannons in mind to maintain some kind of stability, both in battle and then just kind of cruising around the seas. These new guns, you kind of need to have them in turrets for them to make much sense. Ships weren't really designed for that, so even if you figure out the metallurgy and the steam engine and all that kind of noise, you still need to figure out just naval architecture. It's quite difficult, more difficult than you might think. If it sounds intimidating, by the way, it should, because it was quite a challenge. Anyway, so by the late 1850s, you start seeing experiments work. And the French were actually the first to get there, here with the first really ocean-going steam ironclad. So the title, the picture has La Gloire Frégate, or sorry, just Gloire Frégate, 1969, right? So, sorry, 1869, so in 1869. Really, though, it was by this point, it was about 10 years old. The French launched that vessel in 1859. As you can see, right, it's transitionary. It's a transition vessel. It has a screw, so kind of an early propeller. You can't quite see that. That's in back, but also has sails, which makes sense because the early engines weren't one, not super reliable, and two, not very efficient, right? So you burn through a lot of coal, so it makes sense to have sails. You know, the wind's going your direction anyway. Might as well roll with it. The other thing I'll note is that it's an ironclad, right? And the clad is important. So ironclad is, it was a wooden ship that they put iron plating onto. The superstructure, like it was, again, European shipbuilders knew how to make stuff out of wood. So the iron was just kind of additional armor. Okay, so it was a very well armored. It was very much like an old sailing ship that has just been upgraded, right? And it very much looks like that. Right. So you have that coming, Le Gloire, coming out of France, and also some experimental ocean-going ironclads coming out of the UK around this time. But really, when we're talking about the most famous ironclads of the era, it's coming out of the American Civil War, right? And in fact, it's the first time in human history they get a battle of an ironclad on an ironclad, and that's the Battle of Hampton Roads in March 1862. And so what you have here, if you look on the screen, on the left, you have the CSS Virginia, which was actually a Union ship scuttled at the start of the Civil War when the U.S. Navy kind of had to abandon naval dockyard in Virginia. The Confederates managed to raise the ship, the USS Merrimack, I believe. Yes, USS Merrimack. They raised the Merrimack. They put armored plate around. They kind of built a casemate, right? It almost looks like a castle they built on top out of iron. They have some kind of old-style cannons in there, and they have a tall smokestack for a steam engine. On the right side of your screen, you can see the USS Monitor, which was built from the ground up as an ironclad. It's an interesting ship, right? It's got some pretty advanced features, notably a rotating turret. It's much lower in the water. It almost looks a bit like a submarine. Okay, it's the time they would have called these things gunboats, which were a thing at the time, if you can imagine, just kind of small boats with one or two guns to kind of swarm around and either protect larger ships or harass enemy large ships. So, the Union have very much, the Monitor, they're kind of taking a gunboat kind of approach. The Confederates, they took kind of just a floating gun platform and put armor on it. Now, the battle was inconclusive. One thing to note, in fact, the Confederates, I think, one or two more. I built a few more ironclads. The Union produces far more of them, and they get pretty good at building, actually, not just Monitors, but different classes of ironclad ships by the end of the war. What's important to remember here, though, is that the vast majority of these ironclads were designed for either green water tasks, so that's, again, very close to coasts, not really designed for ocean going. In fact, the USS Monitor here was lost to sea conditions not long after this battle. And then, or brown water, right? So that's kind of riverine operations, so rivers, bays, right? If you can imagine muddy water, right? So they weren't really ocean-going ships, but they were a start. Anyway, that battle was inconclusive because basically neither side could figure out how to mount a large enough cannon on their ships that could destroy the other ship's armor without knocking themselves over, right? It speaks to some of those difficulties. However, imagine, though, within 11 years going from that to this, right? So in the 1860s, 1870s, you get really the start of what's often called the second industrial revolution, right? This is industrial revolution. It's less about iron and, for example, weaving clothes and all that kind of stuff, and more about pharmaceuticals, chemicals, steel, electricity, that kind of stuff. Much more scientific, much more centrally controlled. And so once you do that, it becomes easier to build ships with made out of better metals. The HMS Devastation it's still built out of iron, but it's an iron that's a much higher quality than earlier ironclads. Two, with fairly reliable engines, right? And so there's a mast. You can see there's a masthead, right? And they've got a crow's nest, but there aren't any actual sails. That's just how they're used to. They've got the mast mounted, right? They have that old system, the Mark I eyeball for finding stuff. But it's very much, you can see the smokestacks. It's designed as, from the ground up, as an all-metal, steam-powered capital ship, right? Now, this kind of class of battleship is called a pre-dreadnought. Obviously, they did not call it a pre-dreadnought at the time, just like I would hope people going into the First World War didn't call it the First World War. Anyway, it's a name given after, right? And so what's interesting about these ships is, by this point, naval architects, they'd figured out how to build stable gun platforms, relatively stable, but they weren't quite sure what these things were for. So, for example, you get a mix of bigger guns and then barbettes. These are smaller guns. So they thought, oh, will these ships be fighting other big ships, or will they be fighting small ships as well? What exactly will they be doing? And they had good reason for mixing the calibers of guns, because I'll talk about the Dreadnought in a bit. When you have an all big gun battleship, these huge guns and these huge turrets, it's really, really difficult to one, make sure the ship doesn't tip over, and then two, also just learn how to fire them accurately. It requires actually a fair amount of advances in optics and fire control and all that noise. Right, so, for example, that was the HMS Revenge, 1873, excuse me. This is the... Sorry, that was the HMS Devastation. This is the HMS Revenge, built in 1892. One of the notable things about the HMS Revenge, it's the first all steel, right, as opposed to all iron, right? So the steel, it corroded much more slowly, right, and of course provided more armor protection. Here, though, you can still see, right, there's a bit of an influence of those old sailing ships. They've still got mast rigging. Again, they're not really mounting sails. It's just, for example, they're using some of these masts as cranes, and of course the good old Mark I eyeball. You can't quite see it in this photo. I guess you can. You can kind of see some of the secondary guns on the side, right? So no one's quite sure about the whole big mix of guns. Well, everyone. One of the reasons another one of the reasons European navies didn't go all in on having a ship that was just all big guns is because it's a big technical and just budgetary risk, right? It's a big budgetary risk to put all of your to put the funds to build a ship that's essentially experimental, that would need a whole bunch of technologies working together to work, a lot of them new. Well, at the time, Royal Navy, biggest navy in the world, the British, first informally, then formally, decided that they were going to have live by something called the two-power standard, which is our navy has to be more powerful than the next two navies combined, and actually later expanded. But that leads to some risk-taking, and risk-taking that paid off, and that risk-taking was the HMS Dreadnought, commissioned 1906. So this is the first... it's called the first all-big-gun battleship. There are some smaller guns on it, but we'll just roll with it. What's interesting about... you can see here what they mean by all-big-gun battleship, right? These are just big cannons, I believe 12-inch, mounted in turrets, designed to fire big, devastating volleys. Very much a ship designed to sink other ships that need support ships, kind of vulnerable without support ships. But anyway, the British went all in on that. To make this work, by the way, they didn't just need new kinds of new guns and new armor, new metallurgy, but they actually also needed new engines. It's a first warship that used major warship that used steam turbines, right? Before that, you have what are called expansion engines, right? So these are kind of basically like a steam engine that might have been used in a factory or a locomotive, train locomotive. Crudely similar in terms of method of operation to a straight up proper steam turbine, right? So much more efficient, but again, experimental at the time, experimental propulsion technology. So they need to perfect or at least make workable steam turbines, and they did. And so when the Dreadnought launched or was commissioned in 1906, not only did it have the most firepower of any ship on the water, it had the thickest armor and was also the fastest. So that it sets off a naval building race, which I won't get into. That's a subject for another video, or there's a lot of good stuff written out there on that. Point being, though, Dreadnoughts made basically all these other pre-Dreadnoughts, right? Those battleships that aren't quite... Those capital ships that don't have all of these characteristics, all big gun or primarily big gun, steam turbine, all steel, thick armor, all that noise, makes them obsolete. They'd be they wouldn't even get close to this thing. So, in fact, you sets off a naval building race for things called dreadnoughts. There is the HMS Dreadnought, and then there's a whole class of ships called dreadnoughts. So when we talk about a modern battleship, in most cases we're either referring to a pre-dreadnought or just a dreadnought. Okay? So remember, the dreadnought, vice a dreadnought. Right. So that puts us in the top left corner. That's the origin of the modern battleship. I've also put battlecruisers in there. The term battlecruiser is it's essentially, if you can imagine, it's like a battleship, like a dreadnought style battleship, but with less armor and it's faster. They were also considered capital ships. The less armor typically didn't work out very well for them, right? I've also put fleet carriers in there because fleet carriers end up being used the same way. I'll say in a similar way, especially in the Pacific. The Americans perfected this around 1943, 1944. Not quite the same, but roughly the same conceptually. I'm just going to leave it there because that's one of those things that either takes 2 minutes or 2 hours to explain. So we're going to lean on the side of 2 minutes, okay? Right, so now we filled out that corner, right? That's where we get the modern idea of battleships, or at least 20th century idea of battleships. There we are. Okay. Right. On the flip side, though, so we have all these new technologies. I don't want to block out Admiral Farragut here. Oh, excuse me. Right. On the flip side, we have the development in not just making ships bigger, but also making small weapons more effective. One of those weapons, early weapons, are naval mines, right? And it gets confusing because early naval mines, today when we speak of naval mines, we're talking about kind of explosive charges that rest in one place, that detonate when a ship gets near it and destroy the ship, right? That's a mine. A torpedo is something like, you've all seen a torpedo in a movie or something, right? It's basically if you can imagine, like a mini self-propelled submarine filled with explosive that goes in either initially a straight line and later had different kinds of seekers in them. Anyway, early on, mines were just called torpedoes. And in fact, they'd been used by the Russians during the Crimean War, so 1853 to 56, and caused some damage to the Allied French-British fleet. The Confederates used them in a big way in the American Civil War. Because they didn't have much of a navy, and it was a way however they did depend on cotton exports to help fund their war effort and then to also import arms, and so they had to keep control of the base, so they figured they'd lay these mines, right? And in fact, here you can see just a contemporary engraving of Confederates laying torpedoes, as they're called there. You can see there in Charleston Harbor. And it's interesting how they're doing it, right? You can even see one of those old paddle boats helping lay them. Famously, though, for example, for the Battle of Mobile Bay, 1864, so that's Mobile, Alabama, major Confederate port, it's seized. The Union Navy, under a guy named Admiral David Farragut, ends up seizing it in 1864 by just basically charging in. He knew by this point he had some monitors and some wooden ships, right? Monitors, those ironclads I mentioned. He was in on one of the wooden ships, and there's this great line where they're going in to seize Mobile Bay, and one of his subordinates comes up and says, "Admiral, what about the torpedoes?" And he says, "Damn the torpedoes." Cool, right? Really, really cool. So obviously it's being used in a U.S. Navy recruiting poster, I believe from the First World War. Right, so they're, if you're looking at that, right, in terms of how we often talk about, for example, naval drones today, the masterful way that the Ukrainians have used drones against the Russian Black Sea Fleet, people started talking about that, similar terms, right, for torpedoes and, we'll say mines, okay, well, they use the term torpedoes for static mines. I'm just going to use the term mine in terms of mines, and then later self-propelled torpedoes, right? Well, it's great. You're building this big battleship. Not everyone can afford to build a big battleship, but if we build weapons that are so small that your big battleship can't hit it, right, and so fast that you can't maneuver away from it, then even though a smaller navy, for example, especially the French Navy after the 1870s, after 1870, 1871, the Franco-Prussian War, they were kind of broke. They had to pay this huge indemnity to the new German government. And they, still threatened by the British in some ways. Well, there's a lot of talk about, well, how do you use these technologies to inflict? You wouldn't be able to project power necessarily, right? Like the Ukrainians aren't sending their naval drones out to sink Russian ships, the North Atlantic. But in terms of controlling your coast, imposing a cost on enemy fleets for getting near your coast, yeah, right? These technologies can make a big difference. Roughly speaking, in France, there's a movement called the Jeune École. The Jeune École that talks about using these new technologies. I'm not going to get into doctrinal debates, but point being, very popular in France. And, you get a lot of thinkers thinking about, look, if we use these mines and these new self-propelled torpedoes, in fact, the first really workable self-propelled torpedo is the Whitehead torpedo, 1886. You can just make it too costly to send your big ships anywhere near my coast, right? And I can do it at a much better cost advantage. So how do you launch these things, right? Because these torpedoes, you have to get fairly close, right? And if you have a big ship, I should note the Dreadnought actually did have torpedo tubes. A lot of these big ships did, but the kind of last minute, those are like they're not. Those are kind of like the desperate measures if you're using the torpedo tubes on those things, right? Because if you want to get close and use a torpedo, having a big ship is just an expensive way to deliver this weapon that's supposed to be economically, give you an economic advantage, right? So really, you need to build kind of fast, specialized ships to launch a torpedo or two and get out of there. In fact, the Brits are actually the first to have the first really dedicated ship to do that. And that's the HMS Lightning, 1876, right? It's a fast little ship, launch one or two torpedoes and get back and recharge. I'll also note at the time, this is where you start getting modern submarines, okay? When we say submarines of this era, really what we're talking about are torpedo boats that could submerge. They couldn't stay submerged for that long, but you have the advantage. If you can imagine, if you're a torpedo boat, you're going along the water, everyone knows you're a torpedo boat, they're going to try to shoot you out of the water, right? If you can be under the water for even like an hour, right? You have that last stretch of your approach up to an enemy fleet under the water. That's a huge advantage. There had been, you see the uses of submarines, actually, records going back almost to the ancient era. In fact, during the American Revolution, one particularly enterprising guy actually worked to an extent, had a hand-powered little submarine went under the water and kind of like screwed a hole in a British ship. The first submarine not powered, military submarine not powered by human energy was the French submarine Plongeur in 1863. This was an experimental ship, but pretty interesting. You'll note, right, if you look at the dates, that Whitehead torpedo, that's from 1866, right? The Plongeur is from 3 years earlier. And if you look at the weapon, it actually used what's called spar torpedo. So just imagine like a bomb on a stick, right? Sort of, we'll call it a spicy ram. So it was experimental torpedo. The French I think they only built one of this class, but they were showing that it could be done. That said, it had all kinds of problems. The French hadn't. Point being, they didn't have a modern system for propulsion, right? A modern submarine propulsion system, which was some combination of some kind of combustion engine, internal combustion engine, often diesel, with batteries, right? The idea being that you can't operate an air-breathing engine under the water, so what you do is you use the engine to go along most of the time, right? Again, you're mostly just a torpedo boat that can submerge sometimes. And then having some batteries to run your propeller when you're under the water, right? In fact, the first people to really do this and have a modern propulsion system and also be able to launch torpedoes properly from a submarine were actually the Spanish with the Peral, and I'm very sorry for my Spanish pronunciation, in 1889, right? So it's looking a bit Jules Verne, but it's looking more and more like a bit like a modern submarine, right? And roughly speaking, this is how they fit. Okay, the early torpedo boats and submarines were primarily designed to sink enemy ships, right? They couldn't go very far from the coast. That begins to change. It begins to, especially by 1914. The Germans have developed submarines that can go much further out to sea and sink merchant shipping and cause a lot of damage during the First World War. But really, these things are designed to hit enemy capital ships, right? So basically saying we have these small little ships, right? We can build a lot of them that will sink you, and a lot faster, that can sink your big expensive ships. That's roughly in the early concept of how they were used. Okay, so that's a bit what it looks like. All right, and that's what it looks like on the other graph as we're filling it out. Okay, so we have weapons that can maybe nullify or at least cause a lot of damage, or at least cause a lot of second thoughts for the crews of some of these bigger ships, and they can sort of target merchant ships. But we don't have anything that can really target enemy merchant ships. Well, we do, so let's talk about it. And that role goes to things called cruisers. Okay, so cruiser, this is one of the few terms that actually translates well from the age of sail, the wooden ships, into modern ships. And basically, cruisers were designed to cruise, to either escort convoys all the way, again, age of sail, to escort convoys or attack enemy merchant ship. Right? They're faster. They're not as well armed as ships of the line, but they're faster. They're nimble, relatively nimble. Right? They can work with other kind of smaller ships called frigates, which we'll get into those, but we'll just think of a frigate as a small cruiser this time. Okay, but cruisers, they're fast. They can operate on their own, and they can also support a larger fleet. Right, so you have ships of the line. Right, they're these big gun platforms, and these cruisers can go out front and either mess with the enemy or find the enemy, and then alert the bigger ships. Either often just with signal flags and other things. That translates over fairly well to the steam age, and so you actually start getting around the same time you get those pre-dreadnoughts, right? Like the HMS Devastation and the HMS Revenge. Well, you also get from roughly that, actually right between the two, the HMS Orlando, and this is an armored cruiser, right? Designed for very much similar tasks, right? It's smaller. You can probably just, if you click back, if you go back through the video, you can see that it looks smaller, but has the same vibe. Roughly speaking, as we'll say the HMS Devastation. That's because, that's what it was designed for, either sinking merchant ships or screening that larger force. Now, it's interesting because cruisers can do a whole bunch of things, and in fact, you'll hear terms light cruisers, heavy cruisers, Battlecruiser isn't really a cruiser. I'm sorry, it hurts my brain too. And even something called a pocket battleship, which is like just a very, very heavy cruiser. And so, yeah, different. We can see, when I mentioned at the start of this video how different navies will classify different, very different ships using roughly similar terms, right? Because it kind of reflects their doctrine, their national priorities, and a cruiser is a great case. For example, around the turn of the 20th century, the French, by this point, they're getting on better terms with the British, and in fact, by 1904, it's been 2 years since the Entente Cordiale, which is basically the British and the French put aside their differences and say, we don't like each other, but we dislike each other less than how much we dislike the Germans, essentially. For the diplomatic historians in the room who started bleeding out your ears, I'm sorry, but it's a video about ships. So, so for the French, right, they know that the British, right, the British will be probably the ones taking on the German Navy. The French are pouring a lot of money into modernizing their army. They have arguably the best army in Europe. Certainly in terms of the Western, between the Brits and the French, the British have a much bigger navy, the French have a much bigger army. However, the French also have colonial possessions, right? They also have a big coast. They also rely a lot on trade. And so for them, cruisers were a way of saying, well, cruisers can either protect ports or hunt enemy merchant ships, right? Or protect convoys. And so they built their cruisers, they tend to build their cruisers much heavier than the Brits, right? The cruisers tended to be lighter because they're there to kind of complement their capital ships. The Brits also built heavy cruisers, but they had heavy cruisers and light cruisers. The French tended to say, look, we're pretty much going for heavy cruisers. And so you can see that, for example, here the Gloire from 1904, right? It's a big heckin' heavy ship, very, very well armored. Okay. Right. And perhaps the most, we'll say, enthusiastic example of the cruiser concept is something called the pocket battleship. Long story short, during the interwar period, there were a bunch of naval treaties which basically says each signatory to the ship, the Washington Naval Treaty, can build certain class of ship within a certain tonnage, right? And so to certain numbers. The Germans had more restrictions than others. Long story. Point being, they built essentially what were either very small battleships or very big cruisers. The Germans called the Graf Spee class, actually technically the Deutschland class, as heavy. They called them heavy cruisers. The British called them pocket battleships. Anyway, these things were designed as basically gigantic surface raiders. Okay, so these things were designed to be fast. They were designed to break out of the North Sea and go sink a whole bunch of merchant shipping as fast as humanly possible. Also, you can imagine, right, it's pretty much a battleship. So what that means is all those cruisers that you've sent out to protect your own merchant shipping don't have a chance against the Graf Spee, right? So it won't sink all of the British shipping, but what it will do is anytime it's reported anywhere in an area, it's going to mess up their whole operation, right? Also, if you build these pocket battleships and start raiding commerce all over the world, then the British will have to take their big capital ships and go hunt for them, right? The Brits have a much bigger navy than the Germans going into the Second World War, throughout the war, right? So if you have a couple of these things, right, that won't do well against bigger ships and won't get into the operational history, but will do very well against cruisers, well, that makes the British disperse their ships, right? And so you could argue the pocket battleship is really kind of a super cruiser. Anyway, so yeah, that's roughly what it looks like. Okay? We've got, just to return to it, right? We started talking about these guys, right? Then we talked about those guys, right? These almost develop around the same, minus a fleet carrier, battleships and battlecruisers, submarines and torpedo boats. There's a whole bunch of new technologies, and they're combining them in different ways with different objectives, different economic circumstances, different doctrinal circumstances around the same time. The cruiser concept carries over from the Age of Sail, and they're expressed in different ways, right? Again, sometimes for the Brits, it's a combination of the two. The French don't have as much flexibility or as much need for a navy, so they focus more on one, not entirely, but more on building kind of heavy cruisers, right? And the Germans, long story why they end up doing it, point being they end up building pocket battleships, right? That are, they're very offensive. They almost look like battleships, like they're pretty big, but they wouldn't stand much of a chance against battleships, but would defeat cruisers. They target merchant ships, and they force the Brits to disperse their navy. So that's roughly where we're at now. Okay? Right. And that's roughly, in terms of role, what it looks like. By the way, that's not a typo, right? You do get stuff that straddles the line. Again, these categories, if these categories are confusing you and you say it doesn't quite fit, if you're worrying, is a pocket battleship a cruiser or a capital ship? Don't worry too much about it, right? These categories are supposed to help you think. They're supposed to help clarify. The second they stop clarifying things for you, just find a different way of thinking about it, all right? You could say the pocket battleship is neither. You could say it was kind of a bad compromise, whatever, right? All this should enhance your understanding. So if you're getting freaked out about making sure you know exactly where every class of ship ever built fits into this model, don't. The model's there to serve you, not you the model, all right? We're calm? Everyone's having a good time? Good. All right. Okay, so we go on. So I'll note, right, you have this big vulnerability of these big, expensive battleships and battlecruisers and even, for example, your heavy cruisers, to, submarines and torpedo boats, right? And, it turns out that naval architects and even admirals aren't stupid. Actually, every admiral I've met I've been in the presence of someone smarter than me. So, doesn't say much, but they're smart people. So, what you need there is, okay, well, if you have these submarines, which are, and torpedo boats, which can threaten your big, expensive ships, right? Well, you need to find a way to deal with the submarines that aren't big, expensive ships, because you're building big, expensive ships to protect your big, expensive ships from small, fast, inexpensive ships. Well, you're missing the point. And this is where you get the development of specialized ships to destroy torpedo boats and submarines. And they found a real poet in the Admiralty and called them torpedo boat destroyers, later just destroyers. And so the first really dedicated initially the navies, different navies, Russian, French, whatever, really they thought when submarines started becoming a threat, torpedo boats started becoming a threat. For example, you see in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904, 1905, both the Japanese and the Russians, they try to use their light cruisers to help defend their bigger ships. But really, light cruisers, they're almost too big, right? They're still a bit too big, too slow, too expensive, too valuable. Really what you need is something smaller and a bit more specialized. And for that, you get specialized torpedo destroyers or destroyers, right? So 1895, the first dedicated torpedo destroyer is the HMS Daring. Right? But it's interesting how destroyers develop. Okay, because as submarines become more sophisticated, right, anti-submarine technology also becomes more sophisticated. So, for example, during the First World War, the British developed something called ASDIC, as well as the American sonar. ASDIC is just another name for sonar, right? But basically using sound ranging through the water to detect enemy submarines beneath the water, developing different. First World War developing depth charges. The Second World War developing more kind of effective depth charges. Then also hedgehogs. So if you can imagine essentially these big mortars you shoot off the front of your ship. But then sometimes submarines surface and they don't really show up on sonar, so they develop radar for those, right? So you have radar and sonar and all kinds of navigation equipment. And so destroyers, which started off as, fairly cheap, inexpensive ships to hunt submarines and torpedo boats of limited capability, well, now they've gotten pretty expensive. For example, I have here HMCS. How rude. That should say HMCS Athabascan, Her Majesty's Canadian ship Athabascan, is a tribal class destroyer of the Royal Canadian Navy during the Second World War, right? One of the most sophisticated destroyers of that generation, a great ship. Here's the problem. The ocean's pretty big. The ocean's pretty big. There are lots of convoys and lots of U-boats. There aren't enough tribal class destroyers to go around, and you can't build them fast enough. You can't build them. You need specialized shipyards to build them. They need all kinds of fancy equipment, and so that cheap destroyer is now not so cheap. It's a specialized ship on its own. So, how do you build quickly? Well, you build what are called corvettes, right? And I'll flip, if you'll excuse me flipping back and forth on the slides a bit, right? Just have a good look at the HMCS Agassiz, which is a Flower class corvette, which I'll talk about in a bit, right? Look at the tribal, look how different they are, but just have another look. Now look at the daring, right? They just look very similar, right? So destroyers had evolved, and they'd almost evolved out of that kind of cost effectiveness window you get. And so during the Second World War, you get the emergence of a new kind of ship, and that's the Corvette. Now, Corvettes started out as essentially green water ships, right? In fact, there's something called the Flowers especially. They were designed as a wartime emergency ship. And in fact, you can see here on the Agassiz, it's actually welded, right? Which at the time was an innovative building technology, but naval welding isn't what it was today, which meant that this wasn't actually up to naval standards. They're actually technically too fragile to be naval ships, but wartime, the U-boats are ravaging merchant convoys in the North Atlantic. And yeah, they were initially designed for either minesweeping or coastal convoying. But as the U-boat, the Battle of the Atlantic really heats up, especially in 1941, 1942, these get pressed into service to serve on the open ocean. And I'll just note, I'm not going to talk a lot about operational histories, but these ships, a lot of them, in the Canadian case, they're built on the Great Lakes. These Great Lakes shipyards, these small shipyards, they move up the St. Lawrence in the spring. They're just these small ships. They're not built for ocean going. They don't even have stabilized compasses. Half of them don't even have... They have radars, but the early radars they're like hand-cranked radars. They're manned by reservist crews. You'll excuse me if I say manned. At the time, they were all male sailors. You read accounts of what it was like to live on one of these things, and it wasn't built for the ocean. They bounce around. They're actually designed off a whaling vessel. The hatches didn't seal properly. These guys had to eat canned food because any fresh food would get moldy. The floors, all the decks, I should say, were covered in this kind of silt of water and engine oil and who knows what else is just this black sludge. Unbelievably uncomfortable conditions. Unbelievably uncomfortable conditions. Early on, they didn't even have stabilized compasses. It was hard to get a compass reading because the compass wasn't designed for the North Atlantic. And they're taking on modern U-boats. Just shockingly brave crews. So anyway, that's why they're called the cheap and nasties. So early on, these ships that really weren't designed for ocean escorts get designed to get pressed into escorting ocean convoys. And, what do you call these ships? Well, they basically, essentially, the Admiralty found an old name, the Corvette. That was an old wooden ship. This Corvette basically had nothing to do with the old-style Corvette. Long story what those did, but it was just a name. It was a cool-sounding name. Eventually, during the war, these different Corvettes get upgraded. Various upgrades to make them more seaworthy, to get better equipment and all that. But really what the Allies needed was something between a destroyer, right, which are great, but we just can't build them fast enough in large enough numbers. And in fact, what we end up seeing is destroyers end up being used more for hunting U-boats, vice protecting merchant convoys, right? Destroyers are really good at that. They're all sophisticated, but if you're going to build these destroyers primarily to hunt U-boats, you still need something to protect the convoy. Corvettes can't quite do it. And so what you get is something between the two, right? And this is where you get the River-class frigate. The River-class frigate, if you can imagine, it's just it's a Flower-class Corvette that's had a lot of time to go to the gym, right? Similar construction. It's just bigger. More seaworthy, has all that modern kit. Those start rolling out in 43, 44, and in fact, they're built for a lot of, for example, the Free Norwegian Navy, the Free French Navy, and Commonwealth countries. And in fact, kind of built in different shipyards all around the world. And here you have an Australian ship, HMS Barcoo, commissioned in January 44. Right. So, back to our diagram. It's getting crowded, but don't fret, we'll go through it, okay? So remember, these guys developed around the same time as those guys, right? So that's the latter half of the 19th century or the 1800s, right? These are kind of, how do we use these new technologies to build big ships that can sink other navies, to these guys, how do we use these technologies to cost effectively either sink, damage, or deter these guys. These guys, if you'll recall, right, are basically almost, they're just modernized versions conceptually of what the Age of Sail cruisers used to do, right? These are, again, depending on how you're using them, they're either primarily for hunting enemy merchant ships or screening these guys, okay? And then down here, right, we've got these sloops, right, and they're escort carriers are they're not sloops. I won't call them sloops, but anyway, these are smaller carriers designed to help protect convoys. I don't have time to get into it, but we've got destroyers, frigates, corvettes, and minesweepers, and what these do is they sort of, if you can imagine, they protect these guys from those guys, right? Make sense? Okay. They also do these, especially these guys, end up doing a lot of escorts, right? So they're either protecting those guys from these guys or protecting merchant ships from those guys. In the case of destroyers, they end up becoming a bit more offensive. They end up hunting these guys. Okay. Pause if you need to let your brain settle. I know. I'm not a sailor by disposition, by the way. I'm very much of the army, and so this hurt my brain too. Okay, but we'll get through it. Yes? Good. Okay. Right, and in terms of relative size and role, right? By the way, you should notice that as you become more familiar with the terminology, the graph early on, this graph is more helpful, but as you're now becoming experts, well, to the degree that I'm an expert, so not really, this will make a lot more sense, right? So if you're looking at the role, you can see everything lining up. I should note, by the way, I probably should have had destroyers probably a bit further up, especially as they get more and more sophisticated, they become more and more offensive. But roughly that's how everything fits together, right? So just to go from the top, right? Battleships, battlecruisers, and fleet carriers, right? Those are capital ships, the cores of a fleet, ideally used to smash other naval fleets. Below them, we've got cruisers, right, which can do a whole bunch of stuff, right? Either screening and protecting and acting as the eyes and ears for battleships and battlecruisers and other capital ships, or being kind of the center of merchant fleets that go out to sink merchant ships. Then below those, you've got sloops, which are designed to protect against these guys, right? Okay. Good. Now, I should note that following the Second World War, we get a whole bunch of new developments, right? And in fact, the way these terms are used after 1945, especially in more recent decades, they change quite a bit, right? So that also matters, and I'll talk a little bit about why. And I'm going to use one example of, for example, the Canadian River-class frigate vice the British Type 26. The Canadian River-class destroyer vice the British Type 26 frigate that are actually based on the same design to see how and why this gets complicated. So post-war developments, I have a copy, I have actually a picture up there of CVN-65, the USS Enterprise. Is the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. I'm not going to talk a lot about aircraft carriers again, but just to note, right, these sort of take over the role of battleships going into... Not all battleships are gone. The British actually keep the battleship, the HMS Vanguard, on strength till 1965. A very interesting story, by the way. The admirals wanted to get rid of it, but they couldn't. And in fact, you actually get battleships reactivated. The USS Iowa gets reactivated during the Reagan administration because reasons. But essentially, battleships go out of style, and really these carriers take over the role as capital ships. And if you can imagine why, right? Again, they're big, specialized ships, really good at destroying other fleets. You'd kind of be wasted sending a nuclear powered aircraft carrier to take out merchant ships, right? But they're also vulnerable, right? They're vulnerable to enemy ships, and so they need support vessels. So they become kind of big capital ships. And so, yeah, how you're going to use ships protecting carriers and also supporting carriers, it's very different. You also get a whole bunch of new technologies, right, that, again, change the role of ships. For example, you get anti-shipping missiles. In fact, during the Second World War, you already start getting anti-ship missiles. For example, the Germans developed radio-guided anti-ship missiles, and so did the Americans. But these become a really big deal, especially after the war, and pretty much everyone recognizes it. Everyone puts a lot of money into it. It takes the development quite seriously. So, for example, this is the AIM-29 Exocet. Caused a lot of damage to British ships during the Falklands War, for example. Very, very difficult to defend against. And for that, if there are any naval historians or enthusiasts who are still at this video who aren't either planning to disappear me or bleeding out their noses or screaming in existential horror at my fuzziness in explaining ship classes, I would argue if you look at how a lot of post-war thinkers think about, post-war naval planners think about anti-ship missiles, it's in many ways how a lot of naval architects and naval planners thought about torpedoes and early submarines and torpedo boats around the turn of the century, right? Here you have the self-propelled weapon, very hard to stop, a small package can get it close, right? So, even an aircraft. So, for example, the Argentinians were using Super Attendar naval strike aircraft in the Falklands War. And they're very hard to defend against, right? And how do you do that? How do you defend against them in a cost-effective way? So those become a big thing, right? Naval big guns, those big battleships, right, that were great platforms for these huge guns that could lob shells really far. Really, you want to do cost-effectiveness advice, some missiles on an aircraft, or even ship-launched missiles, right? It's nowhere close. And with these missiles, you don't need a big platform. So again, it's going to change naval design, and we're going to see how ship names change. Right. And so the Soviets go all in on these really quick, actually, after the war. They build a whole bunch of what are called guided missile cruisers. Okay, so you can see here, the Grozny, not subtle, right? Those big tubes, they've got anti-ship missiles, right? And so what these ships could do, right, is they could cause a lot of damage to NATO aircraft carriers, and also potentially sink troop ships or merchant ships or whatever, right? And so the Grozny class, and in fact it's Sverdlov class that preceded it in the 50s, caused a lot of consternation among NATO navies, right, in terms of, how do we counter these guided missile cruisers, and we'll see how they do it, right? You can put more missiles on bigger ships like cruisers, or you can see if you can get these anti-ship missiles on smaller ships, or do you put them on aircraft? And different navies do it in different combinations. But yeah, I'd say up until the modern day, when we're talking about a cruiser, right, really we're talking about a big missile platform. Guided missile cruisers, that's basically how cruisers are used nowadays. They're kind of specialized, big missile launching ships. Okay? Right. At the same time, you get destroyers become more and more sophisticated, right? Including, for example, the Canadians actually lead the way on this with DDH. So these are essentially destroyers that can have a helicopter on the back of them, right? The Venerable Sea King helicopter, and here you have HMC Annapolis, the first of the Annapolis class, commissioned in 1964. Now, these were designed primarily as anti-submarine warfare destroyers, right? Or ASW. Now, if you're going back to the old terminology, right, calling a destroyer an anti-submarine destroyer seems redundant because they were torpedo boat destroyer, anti-submarine destroyer. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? However, again, as destroyers get, during the war, right, destroyers got more and more, we'll say bougie, right, which means they can do more and more, not just hunting submarine tasks, right, which means the destroyers are starting to look a little bit like light cruisers, right? But no one's really building light cruisers anymore. Everyone's just building missile cruisers, okay? And this stuff happens because ship design, right? If you can imagine, there's a whole bunch of new technologies coming along at the same time. Everyone's trying to keep up with these new technologies. They're trying to fit ships into missions. No one is sitting around saying, wait a minute, let's stop the naval construction so we can make life easier for RMC history students. I wish they would have. If I have a time machine, that'd be one of like the top 10 things I'd do for you guys, but I don't. I'll talk to the physics guys. We'll see what we can do. But until then, we just have to understand that destroyers are becoming fancier and fancier. So, for example, the Annapolis class, because it had a Sea King on it, right? It has a whole bunch of fancy radars on it. Very important. It has good sonar capabilities, good for hunting submarines. And that Sea King can do a few things, right? It can do reconnaissance, right? But it can also drop torpedoes. So you can use, for example, one of the things about the Annapolis is it's a destroyer. So by this point, relatively big. It's growing. It has all these different radars. It has different kinds of sonars. You can use those a big kind of communication suite. Communicate with other ships. You can go and it also had torpedoes, torpedo tubes, I believe. But anyway, you can go and then find enemy submarines and then send your Sea King out in advance to go sink that submarine with a torpedo, right? So you're not risking the ship. But right, here's the problem. Now you have aircraft, and the enemy might have aircraft. The Soviets sort of built a couple of aircraft carriers. They're not great, but anyway, the Soviets also build, we'll say destroyers, but support ships designed as to provide air defense, right? And in fact, you start seeing different NATO navies, especially the British, build air defense destroyers, right? And they're calling them air defense destroyers, right? Again, some are built more for anti-submarine duties, some are built more for air defense, and that's because early air defense missiles, right? They need kind of a bigger platform, and the destroyer is just like it's the right size of ship, and so again, no one's really thinking about the content, the name making a lot of sense, but they're thinking about is there's a whole bunch of new technologies and we got to keep up. Yeah, so you have this now in terms of both using air assets in the form of a helicopter or in some cases an aircraft carrier, and then defending against them. That largely falls on destroyers and also frigates as well, right? But now you're starting to have destroyers with helicopters and anti-aircraft missiles, and so they're becoming, again, very bougie, kind of big, expensive ships, which means that you need more frigates. But, of course, what you end up getting is, well, if you have this, if you want your frigate to do all it can do, well, boy, if you can get an aircraft onto it, why not? And so what you end up getting is you also get aircraft carrying frigates. So, for example, here you have the HMCS Assiniboine. The HMCS Assiniboine, it's a river-class destroyer. Sorry, not river class. It's a Mackenzie class. Yes, destroyer. Launched, commissioned in 1956. But it's relaunched in 1963 with a flight deck and hangar, right? And see, a frigate, it's a smaller ship than a destroyer. Okay, it looks similar, but you can probably see they're quite a bit different in size. And what they're doing here is that now the frigate It's smaller because it can't do as much stuff as a destroyer. It's very much an anti-submarine, almost one task, an anti-submarine task frigate. So yeah, it has that aircraft carrier. It has that aircraft. It doesn't have the same kind of sensor suite or command suite or communication suite or other weapons that the destroyer would have. All right, so these are meant to kind of complement their additional aircraft decks or additional depth charge kind of distributors. They kind of follow behind a destroyer, right? So this is talking about the 1960s. Okay, does that make sense? I hope it does. Right. However, right. Here's the other thing. When we're talking about these new technologies, we start getting another generation of new technologies, especially in, well, say the 70s through the 90s, right? More and more advanced radars, right? And not just better radars, but radars that are really good at sharing data, where you can have a whole bunch of ships and actually even aircraft all link simultaneously and sharing data, which means that they can find the enemy fleet and begin launching missiles at it in a matter of seconds. And so you need big fancy radars to do that, big communication suite. You need big engines to just generate that electricity, right? Destroyer is a good platform for that, right? Again, big engines to power all this stuff. You also get these things, VLS, or vertical launch cells. Now, VLS, they're rolled out really in the 80s. Now, they're a brilliant system. And essentially, if you could imagine, when we looked at the Grozny a few slides back, let's go back, have a look at the Grozny, right? Those tubes, they're optimized for basically one kind of anti-ship missile, right? And if one, it means that your enemy knows exactly what you're carrying, and two, it means that every time you want to change the missile, you have to kind of change your ship. Well, in the 80s, the Americans figured out how to put different kinds of missiles in different kinds of VLS, or vertical launch cells, okay? I don't know, actually vertical launch system, VLS cell. So VLS, I'll just call them VLS. Essentially, they can fit in the same kind of, if you can imagine, it's kind of almost just like a kind of pit in the ship. You can get different VLS configurations, which can have anti-ship missiles. They can have, I believe that's a Tomahawk firing, a Tomahawk cruise missile that can hit ground targets. And so those VLS, they can, they're a very cost-effective way of having all kinds of different capabilities, depending what's in them. Now, right, again, ideally what you have is it's a bit of a cost, a lot about economic. What you want to do is you want to maximize the number of VLS you have, right? Probably minimize the big expensive radars that you have, right? If you have really good data links, right, and you have some ships that have lots of VLS and those big radars, right? And then smaller ships that have a bunch of VLS without those powerful radars, the big ships can use their radars to designate targets for the smaller ships, right? And it's a balance, right? And so what you end up getting is that, point being, in terms of whether you're building a ship that's bigger and fancier and calling it a destroyer, or smaller and less capable and relying on bigger ships for their sensors, you end up calling that a frigate. It really depends on what navy you're in, right? So, for example, the Americans go all in on destroyers, essentially. During the 80s, going to the 90s, and today, they get rid of most of their guided missile cruisers, right? They still have a few, but they're getting rid of them. They actually end up getting rid of most of their frigates because they find they have this great design called the Arleigh Burke. It's been in production since the early 90s, still in production, amazing ship, where it can kind of do it all, right? They're heavy, they're expensive, kind of do it all though, but so you can launch VLS. They have big radars, they have good anti-air capabilities. Also, if you're the Americans, you don't need as big of an anti-air capability because the world's most powerful air force is the U.S. Air Force, and arguably the second most powerful is the U.S. Navy, right? They have 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, not counting their amphibious assault ships, which are light aircraft carriers, essentially operated by the U.S. Marine Corps, okay? They've got, the Arleigh Burkes, they have a good mix of radars, anti-submarine capabilities, and missile launching capabilities, right? And so this is a gross oversimplification, but the U.S. Navy, the two primary systems now, outside of submarines, are, in terms of service combatants, are aircraft carriers and early Burkes. Okay? Right. Okay. Makes sense. They've had all kinds of problems with their frigate and Corvette programs, which I won't get into. Right. That cost balance works for them. It does not work so well for other countries, and especially the British. And what you end up getting with the British is that they actually end up developing. The British do have aircraft carriers. I still do. They have two. But really, they end up developing more specialized destroyers and specialized frigates, and they kind of have overlapping capabilities. All right? And obviously, the Canadian Navy. By the way, the Canadian Navy did have aircraft carriers during the Cold War, the last being the HMCS Bonaventure. Long story short, it was being used in an anti-submarine role. It probably made a whole lot of sense to get rid of, as cool as it was to own an aircraft carrier. I'll leave it at that. So, anyway, the British have some aircraft carriers, but not as many as the Americans. Their aircraft carriers can't do as much air defense for them as the British aircraft carriers. They end up having to have more specialized, some specialized destroyers for that air defense bubble, some specialized destroyers more specialized for hunting submarines, as well as their frigates. And so when the British developed, we'll say in the early 21st century, started developing a new generation of frigates, they initially wanted to build lots of these things. This is the Type 26 frigate, right? It's a big fancy frigate. It has a lot of powerful systems in it. It has a good mix of a big radar, VLS cells, and an aircraft deck, right? So it can basically do a lot of what the early Burke class does, right? But you can have more of these things, right? And arguably they're cheaper. Not arguably, they definitely are cheaper. Here's the thing, though. The Type 26, it is a very high-end frigate. It's a very bougie frigate, right? So it's like, you go to get chips at the dépanneur there, and you're like, this is Miss Vicky's. This isn't Lay's chips here. So, they have these frigates. The Type 26, it can do a lot of stuff. The problem is that it can do so many capabilities. It has so many capabilities that the kind of dollar to missile ratio is actually kind of low, right? Because it does everything well, it does everything expensively. And so the British Type 26 frigate, again, everything with F is a frigate, everything D is classified as a destroyer. It was supposed to take some of the capabilities of the old Type 42, which was like an old Type 42 actually they're called guided missile destroyers. Very confusing, I know, but their main role was actually that air defense bubble, okay? The Type 42. So these guys did air defense. Yeah. And these guys did a lot of anti-submarine warfare. The Type 26 can do both, okay? But they're very expensive, which means they're no longer really frigates, right? They're almost kind of halfway to being a destroyer. There's no way the Brits could build enough of them to do what frigates do, which is be lots of places at the same time. And so they end up developing at the same time something called the Type 31, which is a less capable frigate, right, that has fewer capabilities. However, it is more cost effective, right, which means you have enough frigates to be in many places at many times, whether around the world or around your fleet. And also, again, you can data link, right? You can put VLS cells from this sucker, data link them, get the data, targeting data from your Type 26, and launch the missiles. At the same time, the Brits, the Type 42, they have a destroyer program. They're actually they developed a new kind of destroyer, a Type 45. And this is actually, they call it a guided missile destroyer. And this is actually a guided missile destroyer. It has a whole bunch of VLS cells, but not as good as, for example, air defense or anti-submarine warfare, relative to what the Type 42 was, right? So some of those functions, they put the Type 26, sort of their super frigate, and some of them into kind of a specific destroyer program. If you'll allow me to editorialize here a bit, the other thing to keep in mind is that the Type 26, this kind of super frigate, if you call it a destroyer, right, and it comes up in a budget review, you call it a destroyer, the Type 26, and you have another replacement destroyer program ongoing, which they do actually, they're actually planning something for out here, and a budget review comes up, well, someone's going to say, like, we have a destroyer at home, and they might cancel it, right? But if you have 2 frigates in development, and this destroyer needs a replacement, and you don't have another destroyer, it makes the argument simpler. Okay, so they're calling the Type 26 a frigate, and it's a heavy frigate. Now, let's go to Canada, right? The Canadians are also gonna are building right now the new Canadian surface combatant based off the Type 26 called the River class destroyer. Now, why? One, the River class, essentially the Canadian requirements, the proposed new ships being built, they're a bit bigger than the Type 26, and that's because they can link in, they have fancy American radars that help do ballistic missile defense, roughly speaking, okay? So at one point, they're just fancier, they're a bit bigger, and so because they're a bit bigger, maybe it makes sense to call them destroyers. But it's not the size that really, sometimes it isn't the size that matters, right? And it's really it's about the role, right? So if you look at what the Canadian surface combatant is meant to replace, is actually two ships. One, the Iroquois type destroyers, which aren't in service anymore, and 2, the Halifax patrol frigates, right? And so we'll just go back, right? Oh no, there we are. If I go back, you can see that that the functions of that old British destroyer are actually being split between 2 new kinds of ships, right? Whereas the Canadians are actually consolidating into one kind of ship. And that makes a whole lot of sense, right? If you look at what, the Canadian national shipbuilding strategy, right? It's also about resuscitating shipyards and developing some kind of national capability to sustain defense production, which is a very good idea, right? Well, it's easier to build 1 class of ship than 2. By the way, in this process, the Parliament Budget Office said we should also maybe buy some River class frigates, call them destroyers, and then buy something called the Frem, which is a Franco-Italian ship, very good one, a very cost-effective frigate down here. But one of the reasons that Canadian Navy leaders weren't big on it is because, well, yeah, it seems cheaper, but now I have to train crews in 2 kinds of ships, right? And I have to maintain 2 kinds of ships, and we're building them in Canada. We have to have shipyards building 2 kinds of ships, and we just can't do it, right? Some of our main bottlenecks, finances are a big deal. They always are. They are for every military. But for the Canadians especially, it's also about shipyard capacity and training capacity, right? And so, yeah, it makes sense to actually consolidate a lot of the functions that we had in the destroyers, the Iroquois class destroyer, the Halifax, into one. And at that point, it really is a destroyer, and they're calling it that because it's kind of the backbone, right? Frigates tend to, if you look at how they're used, right, they're supposed to be used in tandem with the destroyers. Well, we're not really going to have any frigates, so you might as well just call them a destroyer, right? And they're going to look very similar. So I hope I didn't break your brain too much, right? That last example. Again, if you're confused by this whole like Type 26, just ignore it. The second any of this stops becoming useful, the second it starts becoming more confusing, don't worry about it. But what I'm doing here is I'm trying to show you that if you're trying to find out the difference between a frigate and a destroyer, don't look at the exact specifics, right? Usually when navies call something a frigate or a destroyer, right? Navies, representing their governments, they're trying to communicate something. And that's what's interesting, right? It can help you. I'm not going to give you this shouldn't give you better answers, but hopefully it gives you slightly better questions. Anyway, I hope this video has been useful. If it hasn't, please be gentle in the comments. Let me know what would be more useful. And, I guess, what do we say? Safe wins.